Hi, everyone.
Hello.
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 Hi, welcome to season 2, episode 13 of Inside the Rookery. This week, I'm joined by Francesco Nepitello and my fellow Rooks, the two Andys. And we're going to be talking about designing RPGs and board games today. As always, thanks to our patrons and our Discord server Corvids, who have pre-submitted questions, which I have in banners, and I will be bringing them up as we go through the stream. But please do, as always, jump into the comments with any chat and any additional questions you'd like to pop in, and I will bring them up for Francesco, or for any of the other Rooks, should you so desire. So welcome, Francesco. Would you like to introduce yourself before we kick off?
Well, my name is Francesco Nepitello, and I'm an Italian game designer, specifically from Venice. And I have been designing games for quite a while because my first game was published in 1993. So next year it's going to be the third decade since I started this. Hopefully for more decades.
You'll have to have a party next year.
Yep.
So I will bring up this question, which appropriately, because I think he was first on the stream tonight, is from Seagoat, who has asked, do you feel it is easier to write mechanics and rules for board games or for role-playing games?
Well, I started as a game designer for any type of game because, and interestingly enough, I started working for a studio that is exactly in this building where I live now, by coincidence. But yeah, 30 years ago, almost. And Studio Jockey. That was specialized in gaming in general, but gaming like stuff like crosswords and stuff for newspapers, but also board games. And me and my current associate, Marco Maggi, we came to work in Studio Jockey exactly because we were role players, and all the other guys in the studio were not, with the exception of one. So they wanted to have an insight in that type of world. And so there was an exchange of experiences there between their expertise as board game designers and ours as role players, even if, of course, we were enthusiasts for games in general because we played war games and all that type of things anyway. Eventually, so I designed both things, and whether it's easier to do one or the other, I'm not sure. I think it's a very, very different thing to me because with role-playing games, there's the additional problem that I have to write in English, and because the Italian market is, it's there, but until a few years ago, it was basically non-existent. So, and in any case, it was much better if we could export our work elsewhere. And since role-playing games are mainly pages and pages of words, not only rules, but also lore and stuff like that, we had to be at least proficient to a certain level to be able to write some passable English at least. So that makes it more complicated for us, more complicated. And so, and also it's a thing like 360 degrees where you have to consider the tight connection between rules and theme, where sometimes with board games is not necessarily so, especially if they tend to be abstract. And also I find that working on role-playing games is more of a solo type of task, where I spend a lot of the time designing by myself things, or there's a main designer and some developer or additional writers, where with board games, I always designed games with Marco, and so it was at least 50% and completely 50%, very much a back and forth thing. It's really hard to say if any board game we published was made more by me or by him or by anyone else who was in the team. So yeah, it's a very different thing. I might say that I find designing board games more relaxing, like it's more of a laid back type of thing, because there's no necessity of filling pages. So maybe it's less hard on the deadline part. So maybe the answer is this one. Yeah, I find it easier to write mechanics for board games than role-playing games.
Ditto. No, but seriously, I think the last section of what Francesco says there pretty much sums up my entire experiences in this, with board games, or indeed writing mini games that might sit within inside a role-playing game. So, for example, a small aside that sits inside a campaign, which has its own separate rules that you can drop in, use as its own little separate game within the game, and then move back to the role-playing sections. They do not require pages and pages and pages of writing. In fact, almost the opposite is required, because your writing has to be super clean and ensure that the rules are super clear. Where on role-playing games, there's so much more to do. just so much more to do, which is why it's quite important sometimes to have a single individual who is sitting there at the top who says, this is how we're going to ensure that focus is kept in place. A single developer, which is why, again, I completely agree. It's often, even when you're working with a large team, it sometimes feels far more like a solo experience.
Yeah.
Comment.
If I can, oh, sorry, Lindsay.
No, I was just going to say, I popped down a comment from Seagoat just on board games in multiple language. Yeah, you usually get a pamphlet of English, German, French, Italian, maybe a couple of others.
Yeah. Even if, again, since we most work with foreign publishers, you still give them English rules anyway. Also, there's, the thing that you all know, that designers shouldn't be allowed to write the rules themselves, especially for board games, because it is very often the case that A, they don't know how to write good rules, or B, you know the game so well, it's impossible for you to write it in a way that is concise and easy to understand, because for you it's just second nature. So for board games, usually someone else should write the rules. But yeah, going back to the connection between board games and role-playing games and writing lots of stuff for role-playing games, one thing that I'm trying to bring to writing role-playing games is to be less wordy, is to use less words to say things. Because I think there's one issue with how writers for role-playing games are paid, the fact that you are paid per word. And especially scenario writers tend to go overboard with descriptions and stuff that is not really necessary there, just because you're filling the page, where you might dry up the stuff and do a better work also for the players, because if you have less to read, some writing that is more effective and more direct, the player is served better, because it's easier for you to present the scenario. But yeah, we need to change the fact that people is paid per word, because otherwise this is not going to change anytime soon.
I could only agree in that one 100%. Indeed, with the recent contracts we've been doing, we've stopped paying per word completely, and we pay for a piece. And the piece should be so long, it should cover so much. And that's loosely how it works, with a nice little addendum for what happens if it's over a certain word counts, what happens if these things haven't been covered or need to be covered. But word count is particularly, I've seen because I've obviously received so many adventures in my time from so many people, it's sometimes a killer for a good adventure. Because some role-play writers think of themselves as authors, so they spend far too much time spinning the world around them, which is a world that the GM almost certainly will present in their own way, because they've got their own version of what the world is. So you're better painting in loose strokes rather than in tight details. Tight details where they're required only. And yeah, word count can be a killer. So yeah, removing that is a good idea.
got a comment here. I imagine board game rules have to be concise and clear and expected to be used as written, where role-playing games are interpreted by the GM and modified on the fly when playing. I was just thinking as we were going through, there wasn't a question, but the question of which do you prefer to read and interpret, board game rules or role-playing rules? I have to say I'm firmly in the role-playing rules camp because I find it such a chore to read board game rules. And that's why we have Andy Law, the games butler, for all our games nights.
I think it's interesting.
Everyone has a game butler.
Yeah,
the rules guy.
It's interesting looking at how some board games are sort of structuring their rules sort of differently nowadays. Like the way the second edition of the X-Wing miniatures game was presented, where there's a very, very basic quick play rules, like one side, but then the main rules are actually just like a glossary, like an A to Z glossary. So you just, when you need to look up a term, that's where the detailed rules are. And when I first took it out of the box, I'm like, that's bonkers. But actually, when you're playing on the table, it's exactly what you needed. You need to quickly find the rule when you need it. That was the way to do it. So. Yeah.
I just do want to say for an honourable mention to the third Andrew in our games group, because he is also an honorary games butler, not at our house because he's not a butler here, but at his own house, and he occasionally brings a new game and has already learned the rules. So top marks to Andrew, number 3.
And he also is the one who is easiest. If none of us wants to read the new rules, he's the one that's easiest to pressure into.
He's like, I will.
Yeah, the problem of learning the rules in board games and most of them being chore, as you said, Lindsay, is exactly the problem with the hobby in general. I mean, if there was a way to telepathically transfer the knowledge of the game rules to the players, we would have, I don't know, like a 300% increase in board game sales. That's absolutely the main hurdle. Absolutely.
Yeah, I completely
and I think
agree.
Most companies do not realize this, and they do not think they should have specialized people there to write the rules.
It's super important.
I was just going to say, I work in a department where we all love an intellectual mind game. That sounds really bad. But you know what I mean. People love a board game, but people tend to go back to the ones that they had learned themselves when they were playing as a family. And those games, by and large, are awful. You know, they're not well balanced. They're not fun to play. And I think those people are absolutely crying out. And I know that because a lot of them ask me, like, what game should I play? But when I say to them, here's a selection of like starter games you should play, you have to say to them, but you will have to take like a little while to learn the rules, because it's not like, do you remember the first time you played, I don't know, Monopoly? And they'll be like, well, like I don't. I just, like, it was a thing we played as a family, and we just kind of like, I was taught when I was a kid and I just sort of learned it. It's kind of like learning a language. It's much easier to learn through like just like sponging it up and absorbing it in than it is by structured when you're 25 through play. Yeah,
it's interesting to see, particularly with the advent of computer game versions of board games that can teach you how to do it, and the number of streams that you can find online, or video on demand that you can find online, where they will take you step by step through the rules of the game as a way of attempting to jump that hurdle. But there's such a reluctance to watch video among a certain part of the audience that they don't fix the problem. Indeed, the rules might be there, sitting there, and it might be the best video in the world that will take you step by step through every rule and make you go, oh, that was so easy. But people are still super reluctant to engage with it. They'd much rather have someone come around their house and say, this is what you do, play it through experience, it'll be fine. But it's getting that over that first hurdle.
There's also twice I've watched videos on YouTube to explain the rules, and twice they've got the rules wrong in the video. So I'm like, I don't trust you.
Around our household, we call that the advanced version of the rules.
Videos really need too much focus. You can't watch a 15-20 minutes video of someone showing you how to play a game, because you need to stay there and watch it. You can't do something else. That's not there. We need a way to do that. And in any case, going back to the differences between role-playing games and board games as far as the rules are concerned. Reading role-playing game rules is usually much more fun because everything is put together with the theme, with the mood of the game. And if on one side it's a bad thing that role-playing game designers and writers are authors, on one side it's a bad thing because they tend to go overboard in some directions, but it's a good thing when you can read a good rule book from the beginning to the end without getting tired and so on, because it's written well. But I think we need a combination of the two. We need a way to convey the rules directly and easily, still with mood, still with theme, without losing that part, but without getting too fancy and wax too lyrical and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's role-playing books are particularly fascinating because you pop to a con and you're speaking to your customers, and there are a number of them that buy role-playing books not to play but to read is quite significant. And the number of them who buy it to read with the intention of playing but never getting round to playing is also significant. So the rules section of rules, personally, I would like to keep as brief as possible, with the theme and tone written all the way through it. But again, concise is important. But the actual reading parts, so to speak, of role-playing books and the art that supports that are, for me, super important, because most books will be consumed on the role-play side as something to read as much as something to play. And keeping that in mind for your releases is pretty important, which is obviously the opposite on board games, where the rules are there for one reason only, and that's to teach you the rules and hopefully not bore you.
But at the same time, we have a tendency with board games towards the same collector's bias. I mean, there's more and more people just buying games and collecting them. And so you're buying them because they really look cool. And that's something that is becoming extreme with Kickstarter, because you're almost always buying a box and you haven't played the game. So you're buying it because it looks cool and it sounds cool and so on. And a lot of
looking at my room.
Your room full of cellophane games.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
So I want to move us on to the next question, because we do have a few to get through. So Martin has asked, what's your favorite game mechanic? You can go as in-depth or as broad as you like. I'll start off because I had the advantage that I knew I was going to ask this, so I've been thinking about it. And I love a game mechanic like in Seven Wonders. A, you draft cards. I do like to draft a card. But B, you all take your turn at the same time, because I take my turns quite quickly and I'm quite fast and I can't abide, there's a swear word deleted out of there, like waiting for like 7 people to take their goes. I just get really bored. So I do like playing your turn at once. I mean, sometimes I still take too long, but whatever. It's rare.
Oh, for me, it's a bit hard to pinpoint a favorite mechanic, because I'm very much always looking forward to something new. I remember that when I was mainly the GM for my group, for example, I was frustrating them, because if it was up to me, I was going to change the game every week. Instead of playing long campaigns.
This guy.
Oh,
100%.
I get told off for that so much.
And so with board games, it's a bit the same thing. In fact, I quite hate the fact that there are some trends that stick for so long, like worker placement or card drafting and so on. So because whenever I find a game that has something that I've seen already 4 times, I'm saying, okay, that's the same thing again.
Yeah.
But my main rule for the appreciation of a mechanic would be always if it is serving the theme. So it can be even a mechanic that is bad per se, but if it is working well with the theme in that game, then I'm going to probably like it. But then I also like, for example, one thing. It's more than a mechanic. Is a formula where the game turn works in a way where it scales perfectly with any number of players. For example, so if like the gaming part of every player is exactly self-contained, so it's my turn, something happens, then it's your turn, something happens. So it can be 10 players or 2, and the game remains the same. Pandemic, for example, is a game that does that. Or That May Die from Simon. If it's 4 players or 6 players, is the same. It's just one type of round repeated. So you don't have different phases that break the flow of the game.
We've got one in the chat from Oil Painting 71. Huge fan of the One Ring RPG. Did you have any inspiration for other RPGs? Which RPGs in general, I guess, have been an inspiration to you? Andy's got his copy there.
The collector edition is killer. I mean, it's so good. I mean, it just as an aside, I mean, it's something that some people were not so convinced when the renderings of that came out. And now everyone is raving about the fact the physical thing. Well, yes, of course, I had lots of games I was inspired by, but mainly the main one is certainly King Arthur Pendragon from Greg Stafford, because it's a game I played for a long time, and that for me, I think that game contains most of the things I like in role-playing games. And since I played that and other games from Chaosium at the time were close, I was never exposed too much to the D&D style of gaming, even if I play D&D. But I'm not expecting from role-playing games stuff like what is in D&D. So like leveling up or tactical fighting and things like that. So, for example, I see that sometimes people is surprised by the concept of theater of the mind combat in the One Ring. To me, that's the only way you can play a role-playing game. I mean, I really don't get much interest. I mean, anything from playing on a hex map or with squares or whatever, miniatures and things like that. To me, they belong more, to board games. So to me, role-playing games is all about theater of the mind, and this comes from Call of Cthulhu and King Arthur Pendragon, because in those games, miniatures are really not relevant or totally not necessary.
Same games I grew up on. Indeed, all of Chaosium's output, although in the UK that was often supplied by Games Workshop because they held the license for that. And I grew up on those games, and Theatre of the Mind stands firmly center of my own preferences. But because I was dealing with a lot of Games Workshop properties as well, with my neophyte gaming, the crossover with miniatures and using miniatures in a variety of ways was also a prevalent part of the building of role-playing games, particularly because Games Workshop themselves were desperate to combine the two, because they were looking for their role-play games to sell miniatures. And for all of their primary role-playing offerings, they would provide a host of miniatures to go along with it. So whilst I have that in my DNA, I can't actually remember the last time that I sat down and played properly with miniatures in a role-play game. I mean, I've done lots of representative things for things are here, or little maps are similar. But yeah, very similar idea. Good old MERP back in the day. I never really played MERP.
Bastian says, "Oh, I did. That was the second or third role-playing game I played, I think, off the top of my head." Anyway, Bastian says, "Hi folks." Hi Bastian. Do you think there ever could be or even should be an overarching system for all games in the future? No, what a horrible thought.
we would all be without a job.
Yeah.
Wow.
And also, like, so much of the best games are because the mechanics are flavorful. As you said, they fit the theme of what you're trying to play. So unless all your role-playing games are going to have exactly the same theme and be set in the same world, then any attempt to, kind of round peg into a square hole a generic system is always going to be disappointing. So, yeah.
Well, you might, to start some sort of minor potential controversy, you might say that role-playing games have the same system. Because if you compare role-playing games to board games, in board games that there is a much wider diversity in mechanics, because you can have games like Dixit and games like Advanced Squad Leader, and role-playing games have the same template, or at least they had the same template for decades, since the 70s, and only recently there have been more indie designers that try to do different things, but to the point that possibly I feel that sometimes they went so far that they were doing something else entirely. So I wonder if there's a way to do a role-playing game that still remains within the confines, that still retains the characteristics of what we recognize as a role-playing game, but are able to do it in a completely different way.
In a fresh
I don't know
way.
if it's possible. I don't know if it's possible, because if it's completely different, then it might be something else entirely.
Yeah, I loosely agree here again. When there was a fair amount of discussion when various new editions of games come out, and me being me, I'm very much about the core mechanics that sit behind the scene and making sure the maths work and making sure that everything is as balanced as it can be within the parameters that you've set yourself. I can't help myself. I'm always looking at all the finer detail minutiae. And I had an interesting conversation. I won't say whom with, because it was a private conversation, but effectively explaining that Warhammer 2nd Edition was just D&D. It just was. It's just they used a D100 instead of a D20. And it was the same percentages doing much of the same jobs in much of the same ways. And no matter how much you tried to scrub off the various coding that was sitting there behind it all, you could have just been playing D&D, which of course for the Warhammer market was anathema. And interestingly, with the reshaping of it for its 2nd edition, everybody loved it because it brought in many of the good things that D&D at that point, which was on 3.5, had brought in, but kept the core of what Warhammer was. And as we were building various other games, again, exactly the same maths were coming to the fore. Whether you were working, even when you were working with what looked like a bell curve, in the end, it was still just so many percentages sitting within so many slots. And yeah, I think I agree. It is broadly the same system, but everyone's pretending it's not, with a bunch of outlier indies who are trying to do something new, but often don't sit with a core that everyone's happy with. But I do feel that possibly there is something new to be done. It's tantalizingly close sometimes.
It's not very so we always start off the explanation of a board game though with the aim of this game is insert what the aim of the game is. It's a very rare board game where the aim of the game isn't to score the most points.
Oh yeah,
that's not unfair sometimes. Yeah.
The aim of the game, you'll be surprised to learn, is once more to score the most points. Anyway, there's a question from Andy Hepworth. A third Andy has appeared. Hey, Andy. You must be asked this all the time, and I actually think the other two Andys have answered this before on another stream. But is there one property that you'd love to work on and haven't yet, and why is that?
Oh well, one that comes to my mind, for example, is Blade Runner, that someone else is doing.
So true.
And that's the reason why I can't, but I really look forward to see what they've done with it. And the reason why I would have liked to work on it is twofold, because of course on one side I'm a huge fan of the movie and I really loved the world it created and everything. And And I think it's incredibly challenging to do a game on that, because it's such a focused theme and world that is hard. It's hard to imagine how can you play multiple adventures. But I think that Free League has done already achieved something that was difficult to pull off with their Alien role-playing game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, especially with the cinematic mode, where you basically play expendable people. So you're not, you're not opposing. In a world where it would be so normal to see 9 characters out of 10 die during the story. They made it possible to do this without be a game that you will never play again, because you're killed off every time. So the cinematic way solved that. We'll see what they do with Blade Runner, but that's something I would have loved to try.
For me, it's always going to boil down to something that I've sunk my teeth into and love and would like to express in a new way or engage with on the role-playing front, or indeed board game front. And 2 worlds on computer games have particularly grabbed me. One is Horizon Zero Dawn. I love it. I have all the board game. Of course, I've never played it because it's one of those Kickstarter board games that sits there with 5 million expansions in the corner of my room. But I love that from Sony. Similarly, Mass Effect from good old BioWare. I am wearing the top. I think that pretty much tells the entire picture. There is such a strong theme running through there that I think sometimes even BioWare have not quite grabbed. That I feel that you could make not just a brilliant roleplay game out of it. I think there is an extraordinary board game sitting in there with some really good, interesting mechanics that could be brought to the fore. Bit late now, given that that's now history, about 10 years ago since we had a decent release. But 2 properties I adore and would love to see more done with.
Yeah, for me, it almost certainly, it's books, which won't be a surprise to people, but there's so many great literary worlds and universes out there that haven't been turned into role-playing games. It could be, most obvious to me, be Ian Banks's Culture series. I think that could make for a really interesting hard sci-fi, given it's such a post-scarcity economy of the culture, given how near immortal people can be in it. In terms of what you were saying before, Andy, about doing something very different, like I think you could do a very different role-playing game on a very different scale, and can be quite exciting. But yeah,
I'd like Sylvanian families.
Actually, not to go that way, I'll just do my last tout. The Lego roleplay game should be a thing. I want to build a Lego roleplay game because it would be amazing, but yeah.
That was my one.
Bingo.
No, but Lego, in seriousness, like Lego the role-playing game is the perfect way for young people and children to make their way into role-playing, because yeah, I think that would be amazing.
Young children. I would. You could.
Well, adults too, but it would be great.
Building your stats off what pieces you use. Oh, brilliant. I'm an archer. With a space helmet.
The game mechanics should be completely modular.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not only the characters,
So
also the rules.
Yeah. Oh, I'd love that. Lego.
Yay! So what do you like playing more, RPGs or board games, and why?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Yes. No, it depends a lot on the time I have, on the if I'm working on role-playing games or board games more. So if I'm stressed out from one thing or the other. So for example, right now, due to the pandemic and the projects we've been working on, we've been focusing more on board games. So I'm feeling a little bit right after closing the work on the One Ring. So it was all role-playing games, then all board games, and now it's again board games. So for the moment, I'm missing a regular campaign or something, but in general, I think that the definitive answer would be role-playing games, because even if in my board games, I'm always looking for some really immersive experience. So it's either an incredibly immersive board game, or it's going to be role-playing games.
I agree. I think when they first started talking about a mission to Mars, maybe like electronic storage wasn't quite what it is today, and so they were talking about one of the biggest problems for the mission to Mars would be what would they do for months upon months upon months and upon months, and how would they entertain themselves? And I was like, well, it's pretty simple. Just teach them how to role play, because it's limitless, right? Whereas a board game, you couldn't play that every day on the way to Mars, and maybe you could take 5 with you. That would get pretty dull. But you could have an epic campaign that spanned your whole trip to Mars, and it would never get boring. And so for me, I would always like end up back in role-playing games, because I think they are the opportunities they offer are amazing. Although I do agree that Terraforming Mars would be a great game to play on the way to Mars. But sometimes when we have our role-playing nights, if someone hasn't got here yet, when we used to meet in person, we would have like an aperitif board game, and an aperitif board game would be something like, I don't know, Azul or Quirkle, like some kind of geometric, not too thinky game to just, you know, start you off before you got into the evening of proper banquet of games.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead.
Biggest issue I have with board games is just I don't play them as much as my gaming party do. So whenever we are having like a board game session, I'm always the one who doesn't know how to play the game. And then I sit there learning how to play the game, and by the time I figured out how to play the game is over, and we're playing another game, and I don't know how to play that game now. And the same thing. So yeah, that's always my issue. So the handful of times when I have most fun playing board games is when I'm the one who doesn't like to play the game. But yeah, that's
role-playing games. It's. I mean, yes is the answer. I do enjoy both, but role-playing games, because of the narrative, because of hopefully the and one word, scope. Scope. And the scope of role-playing games is so much wider than the scope of a board game, which provides a focused experience of a particular setting or game mechanics, sometimes because they are not necessarily indicative of their setting. Where role-playing games, no matter how simple they may be, can have enormous scope, and no matter how complicated they may be as a system, can still have very tight, easy experiences. They're just broader. There's more you can do with them, and I have grown up with them since I was tiny, and I just adore them. So it's hard for me to differentiate between the two, but yes, role-playing games.
Okay, Martin has asked, is there a game mechanic, and maybe one you've designed or maybe not, if there's a particular bugbear you have, that you feel doesn't quite work as intended?
Yeah, there's a mechanic that was in the One Ring first edition, and is also in second edition, but I tried to rework it in a way to make it work as intended, because and I'm talking about shadow, the accumulation of shadow points, and so to reflect the corruption and the temptation and the weakness of mortals, especially, but in general, towards the temptation to do things in a more in an easier way, like using violence, or also, I mean, feeling the effect of the outside threat of shadow, like coming from the Dark Lord Sauron and so on. I think that it didn't work as intended in first edition, 50% because it was not done well, but 50% because people took it, interpreted it as corruption in Warhammer, or the loss of sanity in Call of Cthulhu. So I'm trying to avoid blaming myself for that misinterpretation. I think that people came to it in a way that they felt if they were gaining just a few shadow points, their characters were lost. Like if they had an arm sprouting from their back, as in Warhammer. And so I had to redesign it in a way that made that more clear, that it was not that. It was not something like, smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day that will ruin your lungs forever. No, it's something you can accumulate and recover, because you can find redemption. You can do things that heal, even if it's not easy, of course, but it's not something that is going to stay with you forever and you're gone if you accumulated too many. And so, yeah, that was the thing that I think was due part to how it was written, but part of it was done. It didn't work because people just took it as things they used before in other games.
So I'm going to mirror this. Because there's a rule in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4 which was entirely me. So I'm quite happy to draw upon a rule that I wrote rather than additions that were made by other people. And that was corruption, particularly dark deals. Now, dark deals are a pretty simple rule in Warhammer, which is if you fail a test, you can take a corruption point to re-roll it, as the dark gods whisper in your ears and possibly offer you a different way of approaching a particular situation. And the rule works rather wonderfully in practice. I love that part of it. But there's a second part of it, which is where the GM can offer to take away corruption to make your character do a particular thing. And they offer it as a choice. So the temptation is always with the player. It's always about human frailties and being fallible rather than the GM imposing anything and saying you must do this. Now, the reason I didn't like this small part of it was because you could lose a corruption point for doing a particular thing, but it made you do something bad and lose corruption. And it just didn't feel right. No matter how well it worked in practice, it just didn't feel right. And it's a rule that every time I read it, I go, oh, God, I wish I'd done that just subtly differently, written it just slightly differently, so that the theme could have been maintained all the way through. It's almost right.
Well, that's it. All you would need to do is something like, if within the rest of that session you can get rid of the corruption by doing it. So that would do it. And if you haven't, then it's similar.
It annoys me to this day.
The fourth edition. I mean, there's lots of the fourth edition ones that obviously we have issues with because editing and everything got a bit messy at the end. But the one that annoys me most, because it's a philosophical problem, and it sort of relates to that difference between board games and war games and role-playing games that we were talking about before. And it's to do with like weapon and gear quality, in that there are, there's rules in there about, a sword might be a shoddy one, so it's not quite as good, or it might be ugly, or it might be bulky. And, there's rules in there for the effect that has, which can be relatively minimal, and can be more social rather than mechanical. And also there's rules in there about how that might then affect the price of a thing. And what that has led to is a mindset amongst certain players and GMs that any gear with any kind of property level might be available in any shop. So you can just go into a shop and say, oh, I'd like your bulkiest, shoddiest armor, please. As if any blacksmith is actively going to be making that. And as soon as anybody says, oh, well, it's not that easy to get armor, it's quite expensive. Oh, no, just get like three ranks of shoddy and 4 ranks of ugly on it. And you're like, who's making that? Who's selling that? And it's such a war game mentality being applied to a role-playing game that's about telling stories. And it irritated me, and it still does. You can tell I'm genuinely getting really frustrated with it. It's that ideological, fundamental disagreement that I have with those people. But
and ultimately, what does that tell? What sort of story are you telling there? And if it's not doing anything to promote the theme of the game, why is that rule there?
Exactly. It's not being used to tell a story. It's being used to win, and that's not really what role-playing games are about to me, anyway.
But they are for some people.
Let's you go play another game.
Well, there was a question earlier on, or a comment from someone earlier on, where they said that in board games, the rules are defining what you do in the game 100%. Where in role-playing games, rules can be interpreted by the players. I don't agree 100% on this, meaning that, of course, role-playing games are incredibly wider. Oh yeah, that's it. That's the question. And yeah, they're not meant to be interpreted by the GM and modified. They should be applied by the GM and respected by the players. Of course, when they are interpreted and modified, it's because they don't work for your group, and of course you're entitled completely to change them and do your home rules. But it should be the duty of the game designer to make them in a way that you can play them without the necessity of any interpretation. They should be just applied and work. But of course, yeah, the difference is not about the interpretation and modification. It is about the fact that the rules need to be flexible, because the circumstances that may show up during a role-playing game are impossible to just confine, to just define completely, and that's where the flexibility of the rules come in. But this doesn't mean that the GM is free to or the players are free to modify and interpret the rules. The rules should be able to answer all questions, or at least the game should be clever enough to limit the number of questions that can arise during a game. If I'm doing a science fiction game, let's say I'm designing the Blade Runner game, why should I put space travel there as available to the players? Why should they be able to pilot a spaceship? Maybe they can board one to go to the off-world colonies, but they don't need to pilot the ship to model the theme of the game. So you don't need everything in a role-playing game. You should have what you need to model the theme you want to show to the players. So yeah, it's not impossible to make flexible rules that work without the necessity of being interpreted or modified.
Here.
And that would be the beauty of a Lego game. Lego in space, Lego nights. I mean, the possibilities are endless. Can you tell we talk about this quite a lot in the Rookery? The Lego game. So, what was the biggest surprise from playtesting the One Ring Second Edition? Martin asks. And if that's too specific, there's also another one from Kilishandra on the same theme. How long does it take for you to design a game? The second part is, and how much do you find it changes during playtests?
Well, just to answer the three topics. Well, the playtest is super important because, and I mean, every designer says this, because you know that you have your own your rules in your mind, and then you apply them, and you find that nothing works, or at least only 50% of it works during playtest. Maybe the difference between an experienced game designer and a new one is that you rely less on playtests, because you can anticipate that things are not going to work as you have imagined them the second time you read your own draft, even without playing it, because you have enough experience to simulate a playtest in your mind. You can already come up in your brain with the circumstances that are going to break your game, and so you rely less on playtest. But this doesn't mean that you don't need it. You absolutely need it, but less than in the beginning. How long do we take in designing a game? That of course depends usually on the type of game, because for example, games like big strategy games like the War of the Ring can take up to a couple of years between designing them and playtesting them. Asymmetrical games that they need a lot of playtest, and so Playtest in that case is more about fine-tuning than changing the game, even if, of course, you can have surprises and find that something you think was there forever was going to be in the final game is thrown out because you found a different way to do it. You all know that designers need to also be very careful and be warned about your own tendency of redesigning stuff that is good enough, or maybe even very good, but you just have seen it too many times and you're fed up with it and you want something else. So sometimes you have to just resist the temptation of throwing everything away. As a surprise as far as the One Ring second edition is concerned, is maybe the fact that I changed one thing that was working with first edition, and was the having different levels of target numbers, in very common thing in many role-playing games. So the difficulties for rolls. And it's one thing that bugged me a lot, because it's something that when you play the game, it's really slowing down the flow. Roll for this. How's the difficulty? And then the game master have to think and to tell you. And eventually, I realized that this exchange, it's just as arbitrary as anything else. I mean, the game master has to come up with a number, okay? So I decided to make something different and to basically go back to how things were done in the past. I mean, there are many games that have no difficulty levels at all. You just have your own proficiency. And so I killed two birds with one stone, because I tied the attribute, the governing attribute of skills to making it the difficulty of the skills, basically. So every player knows what to roll and against what number without asking the GM. Okay, so, and that makes for a hugely smoother gameplay, because everyone knows and what to do, and they know if they failed or not, and they don't need to wait for the GM to do something. They also feel the game to be less arbitrary, because sometimes you might feel that the GM is just angry tonight and is throwing very hard levels all the time for no reason,
or drunk.
And that's and that's something that I was afraid that people was going to refuse, and still many players do, because they haven't played the game yet. I think because I found that everyone who actually play tested the new rules appreciated that 100%. I mean, they were thinking about it, like they were a bit worried about it in the first half an hour, and then they just forgot completely that the difficulty levels existed in the previous iteration of the game. So that's something that surprised me, because I thought, okay, they're going to resist more. So
I think you're right. I think it's something that makes the kind of quality of life of playing the game much better, much faster. So I think as soon as people actually try that out in practice, that's why they'll see how good it is, because that is always the thing that slows down. You've got a bottleneck of the GM having to filter all difficulties, and particularly if you've got players who then are new to the system and they're not sure, so they need their dice interpreted for them by somebody, and it all just slows down. Whereas if it's self-contained, that makes it much faster. So
on playtesting, I'll add that I've been involved with far too many games that weren't.
Playtested.
Far too many that relied upon the individual genius of a writer at hand, and worked sometimes very well indeed, but clearly didn't in some method or another that would have probably been caught by playtesting. Or the playtesting was resolved purely within, particularly for role-playing groups, and very tight-knit groups, groups that involved the designers themselves or their close friends or someone they've relied on for a while, and they all played in a similar fashion. Games Workshop style, for example. Over at Games Workshop in the studio, they'll playtest their games to death, but they're all very similar styles of players. And then when the game goes out to the general market, suddenly find certain rules get used in a way that they never really intended, because it was written for them and for people who think like them. And then when it goes out to someone like me, who will analyze a rule, tear it apart and go, well, I can do this now. It kind of breaks. And role-play games in particular, they require it, as do all games. But too many times I've been involved with games that didn't. And that's unfortunate.
It's interesting. I think role-playing games do require it. I would argue board games require it more. In that, certainly I think we can both think of at least one example of like a board game where it's basically broken. There was one Christmas. We quite often get board games at Christmas, play them immediately with your family. We had a couple of kind of London Underground themed games, and one of them was a brilliant game. We played it multiple times. It's very well balanced, good fun. The other one we played, we reached the point where like there's no way to end this game, because none of us can achieve the win condition. And the only way to end the game is to achieve the win condition. We are stuck now. And maybe that was a very clever commentary on what it's like to travel in the tube in London. We're stuck in purgatory going round and round and round.
Thematically on point.
maybe it's a meta comment, but it was deeply frustrating. We just had to abandon the game. And we've literally not, it's gone back in its box and we've not looked at it again. Whereas the other one, that clearly had been play tested, was balanced so well that we were able to pick it up with players of all different ages and experience, and we played multiple games of it, and it was always fun and interesting because it had been play tested, and that was the difference between the two. So yeah,
I'll always be sad about the poor Space Marine scouts and Lost Patrol who are truly lost and damned because never to beat those two.
Lost Patrol 2nd edition from Games Workshop was impossible to win as Space Marines. Actually,
it was
impossible.
sad.
The Space Marine scouts would arrive and die. It was so bad that I had to rewrite the game and I posted it up on a blog because the maths were completely broken. They look great, and if you read the rules and play it as clearly they thought the game should be played, fine. But if you play it according to the word written in the book, it's completely broken. So bad, in fact, I remember popping into Games Workshop. It's after I was working for them and saying, "You do realize this doesn't work?" And they're like, "Nah, it works fine. Okay, let's go." "Oh, it's broken." "Yep." "Oh, it's really broken." "Yep. Yep, your game's broken. And this is on general release."
It's such a shame because that scout on the cover looks like such a nice person.
I mean, he's a Space Marine, so he's a fascist. So let's not feel too bad.
Maybe thematically, he's supposed to lose because fascists are supposed to lose. Anyway. Okay, so I think we've got time for one final question, and the final question will be a rounding off one. So Oil Painting has asked, after the successful launch of the One Ring 2nd edition, what books can we expect to see next for One Ring RPG?
Well, there's one thing that is almost wrapped. That is Ruins of the Lost Realm. That is a collection of information and adventures on Eriador. So it's supplementing the core. It's going to show how it's possible to play in Eriador, where everyone thinks that it's just a lone land with nothing to do, and so we tried hard to do something that is going to change their mind. And Gareth Hanrahan wrote a good part of it, yes, and I experimented with the landmarks concept. That is something that Freely came up with our Forbidden Lands game, Forbidden Land, where it's trying to apply some reasonings about what we said early on during the broadcast, the streaming, and so is concentrating more information in less words, and also in a more flexible way. Instead of having an adventure where you have part 1, part 2, part 3, and so on, where you're either going to play it completely as written, or you're going to use half of it because you're going to deviate completely, we made these self-contained locations, adventure locations, like the Forbidden Lands ones, that can be, some of them are fixed, some of them are canonical, so like Weathertop, for example. But others can be placed in different places based on what the players do. And so there's this concept where during, that the One Ring is played with the main part of the game that is called the adventure, the adventuring phase, where you do your classic role-playing game type of gaming. So you go around and do things. And then you have the fellowship phase that it regulates downtime and things you do by yourself, and you can do also with less control by the lore masters. So you're informing non-lore masters about what you do. Among the things you can do is gathering rumors. And so that's a way for you to get information from the GM, and then for the GM to drop things in your lap that you can decide to investigate. So it's not simply a story hook. You're going to accumulate things that eventually you will end up investigating or visit or resolve. And so that's one thing that there are 12 of those landmarks in Ruins of the Lost Realm. Then, because we've been asked several times to do it, we will have a more classic adventure anthology following the Ruins of the Lost Realm. And then we're going to tackle the big one, big project that has been promised in a different age of the world, and that is Moria.
Moria?
So,
yeah.
Yes.
Oh, Moria. Yep.
And that we have already, of course, been working on that since a long time. There's been, again, a good part of it already written again, but I won't go into that discussion. Written by Gareth Hanran, and we're going to we started this and how to make it a really unforgettable experience and product. So it's sort of a prestige type of thing.
Excellent. You have pleased oil painting, so that is good. That is a high to end the stream on.
Nice.
So yeah, so thank you so much, Francesco, for joining us today. Thank you to the two Andys for being my fellow Rooks today. Andy, who do we have on next week?
That's a good question. It's Andy Hall
Andy
next
Hall.
week.
It's a
Yes, it's Andy Hall.
convocation of
Another
Andys.
Andy's everywhere. Yeah, Andy Hall, the principal writer at Creative Assembly, known for Total War Warhammer, who used to work at Games Workshop in their studio, obviously doing games like Blood Bowl, Warhammer, Necromunda, et al. He's going to be popping along to discuss adapting Warhammer into a completely different medium and the challenges that are faced there. And that's something that several of us here know quite well in terms of a challenge. So I'm really looking forward to that one. That's next week, next Saturday.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. And until then, thank you to Francesco and Andy, the Andys. Thank you to everyone who, as always, made the comments fun and added in additional questions. And thanks to our patrons for supporting Inside the Rookery. Remember to like, share, subscribe on YouTube, and I will see you next week. Bye.
Thank you.